Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for coming to the YIVO Institute for this event this evening. I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute. And it's a real deep pleasure to introduce this evening my friend and author Isaac Shapiro will be speaking and reading from his book, and we will have some introductory remarks by Rabbi Marvin Tokayer. Rabbi Tokayer served for many years as the rabbi of the Jewish community of Japan and has authored more than 20 books in Japanese about Judaica and Japan, including the Fugu Plan, which I highly recommend. It's a fantastic book, and it was a fantastic plan. The untold story of the Japanese and Jews during World War II. He recently retired from his modern Orthodox synagogue in Great Neck, Long Island, and is currently writing a history of Jews in the Far East. And just a little while ago, he told me that he's writing, I think, 7 volumes on the history of Jews in India. 8 volumes, the history of Jews in India that goes back 2,200 years. So that's a fantastic work of scholarship, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you, Rabbi Tokayer, to the podium.
YIVO, the writing here is in Yiddish, so I'm pleased to inform you that both speakers this evening will speak in Yiddish. Ich habe jetzt die Kavod zu vorstellen und zu choshever Gast. Mein Title. Is there a problem? The weight of the volumes of Jewish history and the Jewish experience in Vilna, in Warsaw, in Frankfurt, even in Baghdad, is enormous. The amount of literature and books produced about anti-Semitism, the Shoah, the Holocaust, no one here could lift it. But there's another side to the story. Who would realize, who would understand, who would know that the oldest Hebrew manuscript written on paper found anywhere in the world was not found in Warsaw or Jerusalem or Manhattan, but was found in Dandan Ulik, suburb of Khotan, on the Chinese-Tibetan border. What's it doing there? Do you think someone wrote it in YIVO and went to Dandan Ulik and dropped it in the ground? It doesn't work that way. Why don't we know that? It's another part of the story. It's that unwritten page. Next week is Hanukkah. And teachers in all the Jewish schools, right, left, and center, always concerned. What am I going to say new this year about Hanukkah that I didn't say last year and the year before and the year before and the year before and the year before? We say the same thing all the time. I'd like to share a message with you about Hanukkah that everybody should know and all the teachers should know and nobody knows. 2,200 years ago, in the time of Antiochus IV, had an interesting concept that anyone who does anything related to the Jewish religion, like lighting Shabbos candles, or keeping kosher, or circumcising a child, or whatever. Death penalty, no way out. Pork 3 times a day, no way out or a death penalty. It's the first time that our religion came under serious attack 2,200 years ago. Jews who wanted to be traditional, observe a Jewish way of life, keep a Jewish way of life, respect a Jewish way of life, ran away from home, ran to the mountains, ran to the caves, and some, for the first time, left the homeland for religious freedom. Got on a ship in Eilat, went down the Red Sea, made a left turn at Aden, it's the port of Yemen, had a good monsoon wind. Where are they? In India. They land in India 2,200 years ago. And for more than 1,800 years, no one even knew they were there. They had absolutely nothing Jewishly. Everything went down at sea when the ship hit the rocks. But the survivors of that shipwreck made it to the beach, went inland in what I call a jungle, certainly very primitive, and no one saw them for 1,800 years. Finally, a Jew from another city in India is in that neighborhood, and he hears about Indians who are called Sabbath oil pressers. They don't work on the Sabbath. There is no concept of the Sabbath in India. Wanted to meet them. Asked them, you have any holidays? They described every single Jewish holiday in the calendar, except one. Which holiday did they miss? Hanukkah. They left before the end of the story. They didn't know, never heard of Hanukkah. They had every other holiday. There's an interesting story about Hanukkah. Jews being in India 2,200 years ago and survived intact. How come we don't know about it? How come we don't know that the first prime minister of Singapore was the president of the synagogue in Singapore, David Marshall, one of my heroes? If you were to, now that China is in the newspaper all the times, China has a national anthem. Good for them. Let them sing it loud and clear. Good for them. Who wrote the music and orchestration for the Chinese national anthem, which is sung today? A famous Chinese musician by the name of Avshalomov. Doesn't sound like a Chinese name to me. Born in Nikolaevsk on the Amur River in Siberia. Raised in Harbin. Came to Shanghai. The Chinese national anthem music by Avshalomov? Do we know that? We don't know anything. Jewish community in Harbin in northern China. In northern China. Only for 65 years. Produced perhaps the most fascinating Jewish community. How many Jewish newspapers are in New York? I could tell you they had 5 times more in Harbin in Manchuria. In several different languages. When I met by accident Yul Brenner, came over to me. I was wearing a yarmulke. And he said, Shalom Aleichem. I said, Aleichem Shalom. I said, how do you know Shalom Aleichem? He said, do you know where I went to school? I said, no. He said, I went to the Jewish school in Harbin. He said, I'm not Jewish. But you didn't have to be Jewish to go to the Jewish school, but it was the best school in Harbin in northern China in Manchuria. We don't know that. We don't know so much about Jewish contributions to the press, to schools, to literature, and even now, or music, composer, conductor of the Japanese symphony throughout World War II, was a famous Japanese musician by the name of Joseph Rosenstock. Was there throughout the entire war. Could have been vetoed, but the orchestra insisted that he remain with them all the time. In Shanghai, with 20,000 refugees escaped from the Nazis, the Americans, the British, the French wanted to shut the doors of Shanghai. And the Japanese vetoed it and said, let Jews come. It'll be good for them. It'll be good for China. You can go on and on and on. But I'm talking generalities. To me, what is most important is the memoir, the personal experience. I introduced in Yiddish Isaac Shapiro. He was raised in Japan. He was there during the war. Came to America after the war. What are his experiences like? His father, Konstantin Shapiro, was a composer, a cellist, a great teacher. Lived in Japan, running away from European anti-Semitism and no anti-Semitism in the Far East. Lived there from 1928 to 1952. That's a piece of change. I think now is the time when survivors and those who live there, and unfortunately not enough, are writing their memoirs of what it is, how it is, to live as a Jew in India, in China, in Singapore, in Burma, in Hong Kong, in Japan, wherever. That book is precious because there's a human face to that book. And there's a human experience to that book. And it's not Warsaw, and it's not Vilna, and it's not Frankfurt. But it's Tokyo, it's Kobe, it's Hong Kong, it's Shanghai, it's Harbin, it's Rangoon, it's Bombay, it's Cochin, whatever. Whatever. It gives me now great, great pleasure and honor to introduce not only a distinguished attorney, but an distinguished author who writes the book Edokko, which you could explain maybe as made in Japan, born and raised in Japan, Mr. Isaac Shapiro. Need help? Need help?
Thank you very much, Rabbi Tokayer. Excuse my clumsiness. Thank you all so much for coming. Sorry. We share so much, despite the fact that I grew up in China and Japan. I have this bond, this feeling of a bond with all of you here, with YIVO, Jonathan Brent, and you will see from my remarks that despite my East Asian upbringing, I have deep, deep roots in our Jewish experience in Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania. We all share those roots. And although the book is a personal story, and I'll be reading from the book, it's emblematic of the cross-cultural diaspora over the last 150 years, dating from the 17th, 18th centuries, when Russia, Poland, all of that area that housed so many, that was home to so many of us, was ruled by Catherine the Great. And it's because of the upheaval and the disappearance of the Russian Empire and all of the wars and revolutions that so many of us found ourselves in other places, including World War I, the Communist Revolution. And I'll talk about that a little bit in terms of my parents' background. I'm not a historian, and I'm here really to talk about my own story, which is not unique because I know so many of my contemporaries that grew up with me, and they're either gone or spread all the way from Australia to South Africa and elsewhere. And I'll talk finally about the miraculous good fortune I had after the war ended to meet an American Marine colonel from, of all places, Prescott, Arkansas. I've never been there, but I understand it's just a small rural town. And this man, I don't think, ever had met a Jew until he met me. And yet he took me under his wing and brought me to this country in 1946. And I owe so much to him and his tolerance and his strength, patriotism, and honesty, and all the things that I learned from him, I still cherish and try to teach to my children and grandchildren. But let me begin by reading about, I'm assuming that you haven't read the book. Has anyone here read the book? No, okay. Good, because then I won't be reading things that you have read yourselves. I start with my birth in Tokyo. I was born in Tokyo, Japan on Monday, January 5th, 1931. Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychologist, wrote that we are born at a given moment in a given place, and like vintage years of wine, we have the qualities of the year and of the season in which we are born. Elsewhere, he wrote that the country in which a person is born gets under his skin. And elsewhere, he wrote that the country in which a person is born gets under his skin. So it was with me. Japan got under my skin, and it has had a profound and lasting effect on my personality and my life, how I developed and who I became. Oshongatsu, January or New Year, is the most important and most festive Japanese holiday. In those pre-war years, January 5th was the last of 3 individual holidays that marked the end of the old year and the beginning of a new one. And toward the end of the old year, pine and bamboo decorations appeared on every house. At midnight on December 31st, which also happened to be my father's birthday, you could hear the temple bells ring 108 times. I didn't count them, but to dispel the evils of the past year. And they still do that in Japan. The next day, January 1, was known as Ganjitsu, literally first day, and its observance as Shihohai, worshipping in 4 directions. And on that day, according to a tradition dating back from 890 AD, between 3 and 5 in the morning, the hour of the tiger, the emperor would give reverence to the gods in 4 different quarters and pray for the welfare of the nation. I believe the emperor still does that. It was also a day when the Japanese would visit their families in their temples and shrines. And finally, it was a day different from birthdays, on which every Japanese became 1 year older. New Year was my favorite holiday and the one most celebrated in our family. It was a time when we would congratulate each other, and we spoke Russian, so we'd say "S Novym Godom," Happy New Year, exchange gifts, and eat a festive meal. It was the only holiday other than the Jewish Passover that we observed as a family. Outside, we would see our Japanese neighbors dressed in their finest kimono, chattering excitedly. Children also were dressed up, and they played the traditional game of hanetsuki, which is played with a little shuttlecock made with feathers and padded, and the bat was padded with multicolored cloth. It was actually a girls' game, but the boys all played it anyway. The place of my birth, Tokyo, and here comes the reason for the title of the book, was also special for me. Already as a child, when introducing myself to a Japanese person, I would refer to myself as an Edokko, meaning a child of Edo, Edo being the old name for Tokyo before Tokyo became the capital. And my Shapiro grandparents had been the first members of our family to live in Japan when they settled there for a few years after the Russian Revolution. And it made me proud to be able to say that I was the 3rd generation of Shapiro's living in Tokyo. Technically, to be an Edokko, you had to be the 3rd generation born in Japan, but the Japanese forgave me. I sort of fudged it. Let me continue. Sorry. My mother, I wasn't witness to this, but I heard about it much later, had a taxi driver that drove her to the hospital all alone. And she must have been asking herself why, at the age of 20, she had rushed into a marriage with a man whom she had only known for a few weeks. How had she ended up in Japan, about to give birth to her 4th child? Yet there she was at an age when she would otherwise have been pursuing a successful musical career in Europe or America. Arriving at the hospital shortly before midnight, she had to have known that my birth was imminent. I see her being helped indoors and met by her obstetrician, of all people, a Seventh-day Adventist Japanese American from Hawaii. What could have been stranger? where my father was and why he didn't come to the hospital, I'll never know. In any event, it was she who brought me home, and she resumed her musical career soon after my birth. When I was just 5 months old, the Japan Times and Mail, an English language newspaper published in those days, noted that my parents had together entertained a large audience comprised of members of the Yokohama International Women's Club and guests in a little theater of the Hotel New Grand in Yokohama. At any rate, in spite of this public show of marital harmony, my parents split the following month, and in July 1931, my mother took my 3 brothers and myself to Harbin, which was mentioned by Rabbi Tokayer. Now, Harbin had been a reference to a cluster of small villages on the banks of the Sungari River. Before the turn of the century, Russia had been given the right to build a railway there to link the Trans-Siberian Railway from Vladivostok across Manchuria to Russia. And it was named the China Eastern Railroad, and Harbin became the hub. To help construct the railway, the Russian government encouraged Russian Jews to leave Russia and move to Harbin as well as to Tianjin. They didn't need much encouragement. Murderous pogroms in Russian cities like Odessa and Chisinau were causing Jews to leave Russia in droves at the end of the 19th century. A vast majority, of course, went to North America, South America, Palestine. Very few went to Asia, although some did, and some even went to Japan. By the 1930s, Harbin was a flourishing city with modern hotels, banks, shops, cafes. Almost all the business enterprises were started by members of the Jewish community, except for the Brinners. I guess they were Swiss, I think. And many famous Jewish musicians came to perform in Harbin, which quickly became known as the City of Music. All of this was paradoxical, as most of the leaders of the Jewish community were politically left-wing and sympathized with the anti-Tsarist social revolutionaries back home in Russia. My grandfather, my mother's father, was no exception. He hated the Tsar. Nicholas II was happy when the Tsar was overthrown. Although most of his fellow businessmen were ardent Jewish nationalists and Zionists, I don't remember my grandfather being politically observant. I only recall one occasion when I was taken to the main synagogue to celebrate the festival of Sukkot. At any rate, I move on to our return to Japan in 1936. And I remember we landed in the southern part of Honshu and took the train up to Yokohama, where we were met by my father. Yokohama was then Japan's largest city after Tokyo. By 1936, it had developed into a prominent, relatively modern international port city. It had the largest foreign community of any city in Japan, including by far the largest Chinatown of any city outside China. The Chinese, along with other foreigners, had begun to settle in Japan in large numbers during the second half of the 19th century, and their numbers increased after the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, when Taiwan was ceded to Japan. Well-to-do foreigners lived mostly on the bluff, was sort of a hillside area overlooking the port. And there were foreign schools, including the British school where my parents sent my brothers and myself. We grew up speaking only Russian at home. My father knew Yiddish, and he had us learn Hebrew, but at home we spoke Russian, and then suddenly I was confronted at the age of 5 with the English language and the necessity of learning it. I remember my mother came to school with me to translate for me in kindergarten so I would be able to follow what was going on. But I want to fast forward to Pearl Harbor Day, which is coming up, December 7th. It was December 7th here. It was already December 8th in Japan. And I'll read just a little bit of what I remember from that day. I have to remind folks that we didn't have any television or radio. We had no telephone. So the way that people communicated with each other was by word of mouth. Sorry. It was on December 8th that the United States, China, and the Netherlands officially declared war on Japan. And the same day, the Japanese armed forces invaded Manila, then under American control. British controlled Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore. A few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, which responded with a similar declaration. On December 23rd, Japanese military forces captured Wake Island, and on Christmas Day, British and Canadian forces surrendered Hong Kong to the Japanese. 1 week later, Japanese forces captured Manila. So as we were adjusting to the beginning of the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor, we were reading daily about Japanese conquests all around Asia, and it looked at that early stage of the game that the war was going strongly in Japan's favor. We lived I wouldn't say normal, but reasonably calm life before the bombing raids began. We were deprived of food, clothing, all of which was rationed, but there were no threats physically aimed at either foreigners or my family. We would get regular visits from the military police, but they were always friendly. They respected the fact that my parents were teachers and musicians, that we spoke Japanese. We were, of course, not enemy aliens because we had no nationality whatever. We were usually referred to as stateless white Russians. And that protected us to a large extent throughout the war. The Soviets, of course, declared war on Japan only in the last 10 days of the war, and the Japanese didn't really have time to decide what to do with the non-Soviet stateless white Russians. So they did nothing, and it was with great ease that I was able to get a travel permit to leave Karuizawa, a small village where I spent the last few months of the war, to get away from the air raids, to go down and watch the American troops land. I was 14 at the time. I couldn't tell my parents where I was going. I didn't even tell my older brother, although I had very few secrets from him. And it was a decision that I made without any reasons that I can remember, but an impulse. But it changed the course of my life. And so I got on the train. The trains were running. got down to Yokohama and literally watched the troops come ashore. Those of you who know Yokohama know the Grand Hotel, which is still in operation, and the little yacht basin, boat basin across the street from it. And I sat there and watched boats coming in with American troops. And while I was sitting there, a captain came up to me and said, "You speak English?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm authorized and instructed to find housing for senior American officers. Can you help me by being my interpreter? I can't speak to the bus driver. And I have some addresses, but I don't know where they are." So I ended up being made an interpreter. Never had any experience at it. But I knew some of these houses on the bluff in Yokohama. And after we went around and he commandeered these houses, he invited me for lunch. And one thing led to another, and he said, "Well, why don't you come to work for us as an interpreter?" And I said, "Well, I really must go home and tell my parents about this. They will have wondered where I've disappeared to." Although I should add that we did disappear from time to time, my brothers and I, to go to the countryside and buy food. So unless I was missing for a long time, they wouldn't pay much attention to my absence, and they didn't. And as I was walking to the train station, I'll never forget this, a Jeep pulled up, an American military Jeep, and there were 3 officers in it. The driver was a Marine who spoke Japanese, and the 2 officers were naval officers from a LST, the landing ship. And the Marine driver started to talk to me in Japanese, and I said, "You don't have to speak Japanese to me, I speak English." Anyway, one thing led to another, and they said, "Oh, you don't want to work for the Army. They won't feed you properly. Why don't you come with us to Yokosuka, where our boat is anchored, and we will feed you a proper meal and show you how the Navy lives, and we're sure that you won't go back to working for the Army." And that's exactly what happened. I went on this LST. I'll never forget, there was a grumpy lieutenant commander who was a reservist, not a regular member of the Navy. And I could overhear him saying, "Who the hell is this kid? What are you doing?" to his fellow officers. "What did you bring him here for?" I was 14. And anyway, I have photographs taken of me eating a steak, which was something I hadn't had in a long time. At any rate, they finally told me that they weren't staying in Japan, that the ship was leaving, but that a Marine Air Group was coming to take over the Yokosuka Air Base. And they would turn me over to the commanding officer and introduce me as someone he could use as a jeep driver and interpreter. And that's how I met the man I referred to earlier, Colonel Toby Munn from Prescott, Arkansas. And with luck and perhaps something mysterious and spiritual, we bonded and got along extremely well for the rest of his life. And he said, I want you to come to America with me because you have no future here. And I said, well, I'll have to introduce you to my parents and see what they have to say. And so we traveled together up to Tokyo to see my parents. And they were so bewildered and so confused and uncertain about the future that they said nothing, neither yes nor no. And at that point, I stayed in Tokyo with my parents, and the colonel went back to Washington, D.C. And all my friends and family said, "Oh, he'll never come back. This is a pipe dream. Forget about it." I worked briefly for the American Red Cross, and lo and behold, in April of 46, I had turned 15, I got a message to report to the American consulate. And a gentleman there named Douglas Overton, who later became director of the Japan Society here, and who had been a consul before the war and had actually taken piano lessons from my mother, was there, and he said, "Oh my God, Isaac, I know you. You're going to be one of my visa children. I've got a visa for you, but you have no passport. So what can we do?" And he pulled out a blank piece of paper and had the secretary type a description of me, my height, my weight, and names of my parents. And he said, "I'll just stamp the visa on this piece of paper, and don't worry about it. They won't throw you out of the United States." So that was in April of 46. It was not until July that I got another message that there was an Admiral Struble who had been sent to Japan from Washington, and although he didn't know it, purpose was to bring me back to Hawaii, where Colonel Munn was stationed. So on July 12th, 1946, I got on this airplane, and off we went to Hawaii, where I remained for 2 years. And I don't want to bore you with the rest of my life in America, because there's nothing particularly unique about it. Well, maybe. My wife is looking at me and saying, you're not telling the truth. Well, I could keep you here for hours to tell you about the last 67 years. But all I can say is that I've never been happier than to be in this country and to have the opportunity to make a life here. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have, both as to my childhood years and as to my adult years. Thank you.
Before we get started with the question and answer, I just want to remind everybody that Edokko is on sale outside, and Isaac Shapiro will sign them for you. So I urge you to purchase a copy. I also want to say that we have a survey in the program for tonight that I would be grateful if people would fill out. It has to do with how you have found out about the program, your thoughts about the YIVO Institute, and there are forms in the Great Hall on the table to fill out in the event that you wish to become a member or help support the work that we do. Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to begin with some questions.
Once the bombing started in Japan, it was so devastating that some parts of Japan, there was not two bricks standing on top of one another. How much of this destruction did you undergo, or were you aware of at the time? You must have been aware of it, but...
Yes, there's a section in my book about the air raids, which I didn't read because I didn't want to take a lot of time. But the first air raid was the so-called Doolittle Raid, April 18th, 1942. As many of you must know, Colonel Doolittle organized a bombing flight from the USS Hornet aircraft carrier, B-25s, that caused very little damage. I remember, I was 11 at the time, I remember seeing the B-25s, hearing the bombs dropping, and later learned that they caused, as I say, very little damage and no civilian casualties in any large numbers in the city. Their targets were military targets, and they then flew, instead of going back to the carrier, which they couldn't do, they flew to China. And very few of them survived. In China, many of them landed in places where Japanese forces had taken over. Then there was a lull until 1944, when the United States captured Guam, Tinian, Saipan, and islands like that where they created bomber bases. And as I write in my book, November 1st, 1944, was the beginning of the massive air raids that went on throughout 1945 until the end of the war. And the only city that was spared was Kyoto. And interesting story on that score. When I became a lawyer here in New York, I went to work for a firm called Milbank Tweed, Hadley and McCloy. I got to know John J. McCloy quite well, and he had been Assistant Secretary of War during the entire war, and it was he who spotted Kyoto on the list of targets and persuaded Stimson, who was the Secretary of War, to eliminate Kyoto. He did the same, I think, for a city in Germany. Forgotten which one, whether it was Nuremberg. Was it Nuremberg? Yes. And it was McCloy who had this sense of history and culture, but there were at least 12 or 13 cities, if I'm not mistaken, that were completely wiped out. When we talk today about innocent civilians and civilian casualties, we forget that the United States participated, along with the British and other allies, in massive air raids, destroying cities, civilians included, with no compunction whatsoever. Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of the bombings over Japan, the B-25s, developed a strategy of low-flying aircraft, 2,000 feet, who, despite the anti-aircraft guns, came down low enough to drop what were then napalm bombs, again, chemical weapons, if you will, which we used with impunity. And the worst damage that I can remember, and I was in Tokyo for the infamous or famous raid of March 10th, 1945, when over 2,000 aircraft came and destroyed a very large part of the city. And those air raids continued until the end of the war.
I have a question about, the title is Growing Up a Foreigner, not Growing Up Jewish. The Jewish community there, did they perceive themselves, did they conduct themselves as Jews?
Oh, yes, we all identified ourselves as Jewish, but Tokyo was by far the smallest community. There was a much larger community in Kobe, and there was a synagogue in Kobe. I don't recall that there was any synagogue in Tokyo or Yokohama.
There was an earthquake in Tokyo and Yokohama, a devastating earthquake.
1923.
And after that earthquake, the community moved to Kobe. So Kobe was the large Jewish community, 1930s and 1940s. I want to say something else about the burning, about the napalm bombs. In some of the devastating American bombings of Tokyo, the strategy was that the planes would fly a circle with fire bombs. And you count, 5 seconds, 8 seconds, and drop. And so there's a circle of a fire. And then they put an X through that circle and went home. And the fire consumed all the oxygen. If you didn't get burned, people suffocated. So the strategy was fly a circle, start a fire in a circle, and then put an X through the circle of a fire. And it was all destroyed. Nobody could survive that. No place to run, and there was no air to breathe.
There were air raid shelters, but as I look back, they were pitiful. They were just basements underground, below the ground of houses that had basements. But in spite of the existence of those shelters, we couldn't always use them. My brothers and I were I wouldn't say conscripted, but asked to help put out fires with hand pumps. Fire engines were practically non-existent. They'd run out of gas, and so they couldn't come to put out fires. We had hand pumps, and two people had to man those pumps, and someone else had to hold the hose to put out fires. So that the shelters weren't adequate, and the fires couldn't be properly controlled, extinguished.
I just wanted to share with you the fact that my father was one of the bombardiers who was stationed in Guam and flew those runs over Tokyo. And at one point, I asked him about it, and he described to me sitting under the feet of the pilot in the front of the plane and dropping those bombs by hand. And I myself have lived for a long time in Indonesia, for more than 15 years in Indonesia, and then recently also in Singapore, and more recently in Vietnam. And I've collected a lot of narratives of people who lived through the World War II and then the wars of liberation, particularly in Indonesia. So I just wanted to thank you for giving your narrative to us, because I think it's really so important. It's so important for your voice and these other voices to be heard. Well, it's so important for us to understand what happened.
It's a shame that those historical experiences fade from memory, collective memory. It's not anything that you hear the media talking about. I'm wondering what they're going to say on December 7th, which is 72 years, will be 72 years since the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Maybe that's fading from people's memories too. We'll see. Yes, there's a question.
Hi. Could you say something about public opinion of Jews during World War II and, concurrent with Germany's public opinion about Jews?
Yes. I rely not only on my memory, but also a diary that I kept, which in 1941, which eventually was taken away from me by my brother, who then used it. And in it, the things we wrote when we read about Allied victories clearly showed that our hearts were on the side of the Allies, particularly in view of what Germany was doing to the Jews. We were aware of what the Germans were doing because there were German Jews who had fled to Japan or through Japan. You may have heard of the Japanese consul Sugihara in Kaunas, was it? Yeah, Kaunas, who, without any authority from the Japanese government, gave hundreds, if not thousands of visas to Jews to transit Japan. And I remember it distinctly because none of these Jews spoke English, and they would go to the American consulate. This was still back in 1940, 41, before America was at war, and apply for American visas. And my father spent days going with them and translating for them. Some of them did stay in Japan. There was a European Jewish community, not just musicians, but others. And to the best of my memory, all of us were sympathetic to the Allies and hoped and prayed for a victory because of the German anti-Jewish policies. We didn't particularly feel enmity toward Japan. After all, they had given us a home, and they treated us in a proper way. But because of the German situation, we were clearly sympathetic with the Allied cause and celebrated the victory. Yes, sir.
When American troops marched into Shanghai, the Jewish soldiers were thrilled and stunned to find Jewish food. Shops with salami hanging in the window and other familiar cuisine. And the Jewish community arranged parties for American Jewish soldiers who came as liberators. And many of the families practically begged Jewish American soldiers to take their daughters to America, because these people had been in large part refugees from Germany and from other places. They had marched across Siberia. And I wonder if in Japan, where the American troops came in as conquerors, if there was anything in the Jewish community in the way of a welcome to the Jews among the conquerors, or any attempt to send their children to America via...
On the first point, the welcome, I can testify to that, because we had Jewish American soldiers coming to my parents' home regularly, and in fact, by the strangest turn of fate, my wife, who's sitting here next to Jonathan, had an uncle, her father's brother, who was a chaplain of the Jewish chaplain of the 5th Air Force in Tokyo. And long before we met, he was a regular visitor at our home in Tokyo. And when I asked my wife to marry me, her father called his brother and he said, "Do you know these people?" And he said, "Oh, sure. I went to their home every week for dinner. And don't worry about them. They're a good family." So I had support that I never had expected.
Right after the war, when the Americans came in, right after the surrender, even before the surrender, there was you didn't find tens of thousands of Jews in Japan or in Tokyo or in Yokohama. You did find that number in Shanghai. Of the refugees, either from Poland, but mostly from Vienna or from Germany, the number is close to 20,000. Sephardic Jews are another 5,000. And Russian Jews, another 5,000. So there were huge numbers. And they certainly were welcomed, and there was and many Jewish children actually worked for the American military. So there was a great welcome. Concerning looking for Jews, or finding them or befriending them or helping them. The best evidence that I have is that the first Jewish chaplain to arrive in Japan came from the Philippines right after the surrender was Morris Adler. Morris Adler was a very, very erudite and talented rabbi, sadly murdered in his synagogue in Detroit, probably in the 1960s or 70s. He was the first chaplain. And he went right away to Karizawa, which is where the Shapiros were, and where most of the foreigners were, and looked for them so he could inform their families wherever they were around the world via the Red Cross that they were alive and that they were safe. And he looked high and low all over the whole country to see where Jews were hiding or Jews were finding escape. Jews were safe there, but they were all over the place, but not in the hundreds of thousands and not even in the tens of thousands, not even in the thousands. But they did find them and befriended them and welcomed them very, very, very much. After all, we're one family, we're one people, and we look for each other and we try to help each other. So it happened both in China and Japan and the Philippines and in Singapore, everywhere. Happened everywhere.
On your second point, I don't recall anyone asking the American troops to take their daughters to America. That's a new one for me.
Excuse me, I have a question about, you mentioned your acquaintance with John McCloy. And from what I've read in history, McCloy disfavored the bombing of the railway lines to Auschwitz. He also had a role in the imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II. I'm curious, did he ever express to you any contrition about his...
He did. He definitely did. Yes.
I just wanted to ask a question about what happened when the Japanese joined the Axis and with Hitler's attempts to, of course, eradicate all Jews. How did the Japanese government react to the anti-Semitic aspects of the Axis?
Well, you'll have to ask
Okay.
the rabbi here because he knows what happened as far as the
Japan is not good or bad, it's different. Two people were involved. One is the foreign minister, his name was Matsuoka. He is the one in the photographs and in the movies coming to Berlin and signing with Hitler. When he returned to Japan, he said, I promised Hitler to be a friend, I never promised him to be an anti-Semite. And you can quote me on that. And Prime Minister, one of the prime ministers, invited a leader of the Jewish community in Tokyo to his home on the New Year's Day, which Isaac Shapiro spoke about, Shogatsu, which is the holiday of Japan, invited him to his home on New Year's Day and said, tell all of your people not to worry. We are not part of an anti-Semitic campaign. We had a meeting of the cabinet in 1938 that Jews will not be treated differently than anyone else and will not be harmed, and they kept their word. It was safe to be in Japanese territory during the war. Hitler had a personal war against the Jews. Japan had no personal war against the Jews whatsoever. Of the over 20,000 Jews that were in Shanghai, maybe over 25,000, their survival rate is 98%. That's a high percentage to survive during a war.
Thank you.
Jews were treated equally like anyone else. You went to prison depended upon your passport. If you were smart enough to say that you were British, you went to jail. If you were smart enough to say you were Jewish, they said we're not at war with Jews. You were safe being Jewish. You weren't safe being an American or being British because that your nationality, you would be interned. Jews were not interned.
Thank you, Mr. Shapiro, for sharing these wonderful experiences you had. I'd like to ask a follow-up to the question that was asked before. You were in Japan when we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What was the reaction of the people around you, or the foreigners, or your community, and the Japanese around? What was their reaction?
Well, to the best of my recollection, the bombing of Hiroshima received very little coverage in the press. I remember a story that a single bomber had flown over Hiroshima and had dropped some new kind of bomb. That was, if I'm not mistaken, August 6th, 1945. Nagasaki was August 9th. I didn't become really familiar with Hiroshima until I went there in October of 1945, and that's in my book, and there's some photographs of the city. I went with a group of naval officers and nurses, and there's a photograph in the book of us as a group in front of the airplane that we flew on. And we were all absolutely struck dumb when we landed and when we started to walk through the city, which was nothing but rubble. And for the first time, I saw melted glass and metal, which I hadn't seen in Tokyo when Tokyo was bombed. But the atomic bomb was so strong in terms of the heat that it emitted that it pulverized everything, and metal and glass was melting from the heat. It was only then that I became acquainted with the terrible power of the atomic bomb, and what the Japanese people heard was mostly word of mouth, and they didn't talk about it, at least not in my presence, and there was very little discussion about the atomic bomb raids. I never heard the American military that I knew talking about it. And as I say, this group of naval officers was curious because they didn't really know what damage had been done. And they said, let's fly down and let's take a look. And that was September, October. It was in the last week of October.
We have time for just a couple more questions.
Where and how did you get your education?
Where and how did I get my education?
Right.
I started out with a British school, kindergarten, as I mentioned earlier. It was an Anglican school, and in 1940, they closed it at the end of the year because the British teachers went home to fight in the war, and the principal was an Anglican priest, and he wanted to go home and fight in the British Army. So in the early months of 1941, I was enrolled with my brothers at the American school in Japan, which still exists today. February of 41, America was not yet at war, and then sort of the winds of war were coming, and my parents said, it's too much of a burden to commute from Yokohama to Tokyo to the American school, and the war is going to break out with America. So we're going to put you in this Catholic school called St. Joseph's in Yokohama, which was a much easier commute. The priests there were French citizens, for the most part from Alsace. It was a Marianist school, not a Jesuit school. And there were 5 American teachers, brothers, all of whom were sent back to America after Pearl Harbor. The school continued to function until the summer of 44, when it was taken over by the Japanese military, the physical, the school facilities. And the school moved up to a mountain village near Hakone called Gora, G-O-R-A. And my 2 older brothers were in the senior class there. And there were 5 students who graduated, and then the school closed for the rest of the war. And in the fall of 44, I went to a Japanese school. Waseda University, you may have heard of, had a elementary and high school, was called Waseda International. It's a curious thing. Many returning Japanese, that is, from the diplomatic corps with their families, businessmen, had children who didn't speak Japanese or couldn't read and write. And they couldn't adjust to going to a Japanese public school, so they were sent to this Waseda International School where they were taught Japanese, essentially, so they could adjust and become a part of the Japanese society. And that school closed after the March 45 raid on Tokyo. And from the spring of 45 until I entered Punahou Academy in Hawaii in fall of 46, I didn't go to school at all. I graduated from the Punahou Academy in Hawaii in 1948, went to Columbia College, and then that was interrupted by military service in the Korean War. And then eventually I graduated from the law school where I met my wife. That's the sum and substance of my... Well, I had a year of postgraduate work at the University of Paris under a Fulbright, but I wouldn't call that education. It was fun.
During the war, the American military and civilian population was bombarded with a lot of propaganda speaking about the fanaticism of the Japanese people. And I wonder, could you comment, how did the Japanese public react to their patriotism or despondency when the bombing really got to be very tough?
My experience with my neighbors and friends, Japanese neighbors and friends, and incidentally, there were neighborhood associations which distributed the food, clothing, and so on, which was rationed. I never observed any fanaticism. Some of my mother's musical students tried to escape military service. There were just as many young Japanese who preferred not to serve in the military as wanted to serve and die for the emperor. So all of the fanaticism that may have existed, I think, was limited to strong nationalists, people in the military, and not to anyone that I came into contact with, whether they were ordinary shopkeepers or taxi drivers or streetcar conductors. Most people just didn't talk about the war at all. Or if they did, they would say, wouldn't it be nice if the war ended and we'd go back to normal life again? And that's all I can tell you. I did not get exposed to that fanaticism that you may have heard about on this side of the ocean.
So with that, we're going to end our evening. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Mr. Shapiro and Rabbi Tokayer.